David Rubin, shalom, good morning.
Well, good morning to you.
I see you went from being indoors to being in your beautiful studio overlooking the hills of Samaria.
Absolutely, absolutely. I apologize for any technical difficulties before this. So happy to be with you, Tuli.
No problem at all. It's always good to have you on and to hear your perspective. And just for our viewers, so we have people who are, by the way, watching on YouTube right now. Want to welcome everybody who's watching on Facebook and, of course, on Israel365news.com. Want to welcome everybody. We're living through such a wild ride right now. The historic election between President Trump, Vice President Biden, it is so split right down the middle, 50-50, and it's going to come down to the complicated electoral college, and it's going to come down to counting votes. It could take a while, and I hope it doesn't get ugly, but there's a lot of people threatening violence right now in America, and it's just unprecedented. And we are happy to have you, David, to provide not only the political perspective, but also a spiritual perspective as somebody who is the head of the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund. You take care of child victims of terror in the Judea and Samaria. And you're also a prolific author, and you've written books, God, Israel, and Shiloh, Peace for Peace, Sparks from Zion, Islamic Tsunami, more Sparks from Zion, but also your most recent book, which is doing amazing on Amazon, is Trump and the Jews. And just tell us briefly your perspective on the relationship between President Trump and the Jews and what he's accomplished for Israel over the last 4 years.
Well, it's always a fascinating topic for me, Tuli, because I grew up in New York, and I grew up in the outer borough of Brooklyn, and Trump grew up in the outer borough of Queens. And these were the middle class areas. I mean, Trump wasn't middle class, but his father was a developer, and he was very successful. But Trump grew up in his father's business. He learned certain values, and a couple of the values that he learned were hard work, working for something, and learning to be thrifty at the same time and to be responsible. And those values have served him well all through the years. Now, he was also in his life as a businessman in New York, he was very much an out-of-the-box thinker. And that's why he got elected. And much more than that, that's also the reason why he was able to do so many great things for the Israel-United States relationship. Now, we can go down a long list of those accomplishments. Sometimes people are so focused on the deal of the century, and whether it was good, whether it wasn't good. I can certainly discuss that at length. But the fact is, the moving of the embassy in Jerusalem, the recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital, the recognition of the strategic Golan Heights as an integral part of Israel, the closing down of the PLO shadow embassy in Jerusalem, the halting of economic aid to the Palestinian Authority as long as they continue to fund terrorism. And let's make it very clear. The Palestinian Authority, that quasi-governmental authority that rules in the Palestinian autonomous areas and beyond, they give a payment, a financial payment every month, a salary, to every single terrorist that kills or wounds a Jew or an Israeli. And as you know, Tuli, I myself was wounded in a terrorist attack along with my then 3-year-old son. I was shot in the leg, he was shot in the head. And those terrorists, to this day, they've been in jail for any number of years, those terrorists from the Palestinian Authority. They've been in jail, yes, but they have been receiving salaries every single month through their families by the Palestinian Authority. President Trump said, no more, no more. That's got to end if you want to have a relationship with the United States. So I could go on and on with all the accomplishments, but I think it's pretty clear.
Yeah, yeah. You're our first guest. We've had a great lineup today. We started off the morning with Israel Gans from Shomron, from your area, and Mayan Hoffman from the Jerusalem Post. We had Yehuda Glick, former MK, who's now running for president in Israel. Avi Abelo and Ruthie Lieberman, who you saw. We also had Josh Reinstein and General Gozal from the IDF. We've had a great lineup. And unlike in previous elections, where the word of the day that kept coming up, you're the first one, I think, today to talk about the Palestinians. Palestinians have almost been a non-issue in this election. But you've been, because it's obviously terrorism is such an important and it's such a traumatic part of your life, obviously. I understand why you're talking about terrorism, Palestinian terrorism, but how do you explain how the difference in the dialogue, the narrative between this election, 2020, and 2016, as it relates to Israel's relationship with the Palestinians?
Well, look, first of all, you have to discuss the Palestinians if we're talking about the Middle East. Obviously, the Middle East wasn't a big topic of discussion in this election because the Biden people and the Democrats were pushing this line all the time that Biden is a true friend of Israel, and that he has his disagreements with Trump, but it wasn't hammered home as much as I think it should have been that Biden was one of the big supporters of the Iran deal, the Iran nuclear deal, which basically gives them a path to a nuclear bomb within a couple of years, and which allows them to have their underground facilities, many of them that are not being checked, that don't have to be checked according to the nuclear agreement. It also gave them billions of dollars to distribute to the terrorist organizations like Hamas and Hezbollah. 1.8 billion of those dollars were delivered in cash by the Obama-Biden administration in the dark of night, the very night that deal was signed. So I think it's very relevant to talk about all these issues. As for the Palestinians, well, President Trump is responsible. And, I'll give some credit to Prime Minister Netanyahu also, but it's mainly President Trump who accomplished and did the mediating to allow 3 Arab nations just in the past couple of months to sign peace agreements with Israel, normalization deals, and that is without the Palestinians. Okay, so the Palestinian veto over any kind of peace agreements between Israel and other countries in the Middle East has been removed. The Palestinians no longer have that veto. So that's a big thing. That is a very big thing. I think it needed to be discussed more during the campaign. President Trump brought it up. Obviously, the left-wing mainstream media shut it down, and it wasn't a big topic of discussion. I agree.
I'd like to ask you, you have a book called Land for Peace and Peace Processes. Obviously, in the last 6 weeks, there have been 3 peace treaties that Israel has signed with Arab neighbors. What do you anticipate going forward in a Trump administration versus a Biden administration when it comes to Israel achieving more peace agreements with her neighbors?
Well, I think, first of all, we have to understand that President Trump has a heart for Israel. And I really think that is the bottom line. President Trump really does care about Israel. And it's for a variety of reasons. Obviously, his Christian evangelical base is very pro-Israel, and therefore President Trump is going to want to please them. Secondly, obviously, it's on a more personal level. I mean, he does have a Jewish daughter who is Sabbath observant together with her husband and children, and does strongly identify with her faith, with her Jewish faith, and President, sometimes we say that that there's a running joke. It's kind of a sad joke, which is what is the difference between a Reform rabbi and President Trump? And the answer is that President Trump has Jewish grandchildren. So I think it's kind of sad that the state of assimilation in the United States among American Jews is so great that they're not keeping their children in the faith. But I think it's an important factor if we want to understand President Trump, that President Trump really does care about Israel. Now, as far as Judea and Samaria and any peace agreement with the so-called Palestinians, well, I think it's important to understand that the deal of the century, which spoke of 30% autonomy for 30% sovereignty for Israel in Judea and Samaria, that's not going to happen as 30%. It's going to happen eventually as 100% of Judea and Samaria. But there's a process going on, and the Palestinians are never going to accept 30% sovereignty for Israel, and therefore it's going to be a non-starter. I mean, the deal of the century really is not going to go anywhere as the deal of the century, and Israel will ultimately, if Trump is reelected, Israel will ultimately declare its sovereignty over all of the areas that are currently in Israel's control.
What else would be on your wish list with a Trump administration? We had Josh Reinstein on before, and he said something amazing. He said that when the Trump administration began 4 years ago, so because of his relationships with Vice President Pence, so there was some kind of dialogue there, and they asked Josh Reinstein and the Knesset Christian Allies Caucus to make a wish list of what you would like to see. And they came back with 10 items on their wish list, and President Trump achieved all 9 of them. They said they would be happy with 3, and Trump achieved 9 out of 10. What's the one thing that was remaining would be the recognition of Judea and Samaria. What would be on your wish list for 4 more years of a Trump administration?
Well, that sounds very much like President Trump, and it backs up what I said a moment ago, that his heart is with Israel, and if your heart is with Israel, and if your political alliances back that up, so ultimately it's going to be okay, even if there are some disagreements along the way. President Trump spent about 3.5 years learning about the Middle East and learning about Israel, and learning about its relationship with the Palestinians and its relationship with the Arab countries. So as far as a wish list goes, look, it's a mutual relationship. Let's make that clear. The United States benefits from its relationship with Israel, both in the spiritual blessings that it attains by doing good for Israel, and by nuts and bolts things such as military intelligence and technological cooperation. All of those things are good for the United States. As far as Israel's concerned, of course, we would like to see President Trump and his administration give full backing for Israeli sovereignty over all of Judea and Samaria, the so-called West Bank. Those areas are the historic biblical heartland of Israel. I can't say it any clearer than that. You don't give up your biblical heartland, and the United States, which is a country that was founded on the values of the Hebrew Bible, that founders like Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, they all understood this. So those values demand Israeli sovereignty over its biblical heartland, and And that's something that I hope to see the Trump administration stand with. In addition to that, I would like to see the United States give passive support to Israel, passive military support and active political support for Israel in its confrontation with Iran, which I believe is ultimately going to happen. I don't. It's very nice that their economy is going down, but generally, when an economy goes down because of political and economic pressure and the sanctions, so it weakens that country. So Iran is being weakened, but the regime and its hold on power is not being weakened that much because they're just transferring funds to propping up their regime, and they're suppressing the popular rebellion from the people. So if the people in Iran don't succeed in overthrowing the regime, then Israel is going to have to overthrow the regime themselves and to stop the nuclear program with preemptive action. I hope that the United States will stand with Israel, passively as far as military support, meaning that they will give us the backing of equipment and so on that is needed. And I hope that the United States will stand with Israel actively with political support when it comes to the Iran issue.
And what do you think about the scenario with more peace treaties with other Arab countries? Is that something that you're hoping we will have, or something that you're skeptical about?
No, just the opposite. I believe that it's going. I'm not just hoping. I believe it's going to happen. It's going to continue. It's a process that was started, and it's based on the interests of those Arab countries. It is in their interest to confront Iran. It is in their interest to stand with Israel in that confrontation with Iran that all the Sunni Muslim nations are facing. And it's also in their economic interest and technological interest, agricultural interest, to have a good relationship with Israel. The only problem up until this point, and the reason why peace hasn't broken out throughout the Middle East, is because of the Palestinians and because of that commitment to the Palestinians that unless Israel agrees to a Palestinian state in the biblical heartland of Israel, then none of these Arab countries can make peace with Israel. Well, that old paradigm has been broken by the Trump doctrine in the Middle East, and hopefully he will win re-election. If Biden is elected, the president-to-be, Kamala Harris, has already made it quite clear that they're going to be restoring support to the Palestinians, despite their support of terrorism, despite their paying salaries to every terrorist who kills or wounds an Israeli. And Biden certainly is going to go along with that. Let's by the way, let's put an end to this Biden pro-Israel fiction. Senator Biden in Congress is the one who threatened Prime Minister Menachem Begin outwardly in a committee hearing. He threatened Begin. He told him that you better stop with the offensive military action in Lebanon and elsewhere. And Begin famously spoke to him as a proud Jew and repudiated Biden's reprimand and Biden's threat. And he said, don't threaten us that you're going to cut off our aid. Well, Biden hasn't changed. It's the same Biden who, when he came to Jerusalem during the Obama administration as vice president, and a municipal committee announced that they've given their approval to building a Jewish neighborhood in Jerusalem, Biden was furious. He refused to meet with Netanyahu again. And Hillary Clinton called up Netanyahu, gave him a stern lecture over the phone for about a half an hour. How dare you allow the building in Jerusalem? How dare you approve a building project in Jerusalem for Jews while Vice President Biden is in Jerusalem? That's the real Biden record, and it is something that we should be very concerned about.
Yeah. No, thanks for reminding us about that. I remember, at the time it was always so stressful that living here in Israel during a time where there was real animosity between the White House and the Knesset, between President Obama at the time and Prime Minister Netanyahu. It was always very stressful. There's always a lot of anxiety here in Israel because the average Israeli really loves America and appreciates the relationship between Israel and America. And so when there's good relationships, it's just been such a, like we say, a machaya. And we're now honored to have with us Rabbi Dov Lippman. David, thank you so much for your fascinating perspective. And we hope to have good news by the end of the day, something good for Israel. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Tuli.